internets, so it is finally time to go over the border question. Or in other words, in this video, I'm going to be going over the general arguments for and against open borders. You know, the question of who should be allowed to immigrate into your country and when they should be allowed to immigrate, and just the various ethics and outcomes behind various policies, along with their pros and cons. And of course, I've got my own stance on the border question, which I'll be going into when I finally reach the libertarian argument against open borders. But to keep this video a little bit more interesting and a little bit more informative, let's go over all of the various arguments out there for and against open borders, at least the ones that are commonly put forth by various political ideologies and factions. And this way everyone can walk away from this video with a much more in-depth understanding of what borders actually do, as well as which arguments for and against them are based on facts, and which ones are just not grounded in reason or reality at all. Yeah, just minor spoiler alert, there's going to be a lot of very fun and very stupid arguments that we'll be going over in this video. Also note that this video is going to be mainly focused around the policy and what makes sense in the United States of America. However, most of it also makes sense for other countries. It's just a lot better to keep things centered around the United States border policy just to avoid overcomplicating the situation. But first off, this video's sponsor is private internet access. A lot of people unfortunately still don't quite understand why you need a VPN while using the internet. And it's often the same old fallacy of thinking that if you aren't doing anything wrong, then you don't need privacy. Yeah, no. This mentality will trap you in the mindset that it's perfectly fine for government and hackers to be able to effectively stand behind your back and watch everything you are doing. The reality is, whether it's those hackers trying to steal your identity, your credit cards, your passwords, and other personal data, or the surveillance state or copyright trolls, a VPN remains the best way to protect yourself from these problems at a cost that is significantly less than the danger of using the internet unprotected. Private internet access solves the problem for you by using RAM-only no-log servers and top-of-the-line encryption to mask your IP online and stop potential bad actors from stealing your info. Not only are they a top-quality VPN, but their app is stable, user-friendly, and available on all of your devices without limitations. PIA also comes with excellent downloading and upload speeds, tons of security features, and one particular favorite is that it is very streamer-friendly. They have servers all over the world you can choose from, and many of them are optimized for Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, Disney and Paramount Plus, etc., etc. And you can use PIA to unlock the geo-restricted content on streaming services, allowing you access to a much wider variety of movies and TV shows. It is also very affordable. If you use my personal link in the description below, you can get private internet access now for 83% off at only $2.03 per month, plus 4 months free, and all covered with a 30-day money-back, risk-free guarantee. Seriously, it's a good VPN, get it. Anyways, let's start with one of the sillier arguments for open borders, which is the no human is illegal on stolen land argument, which is usually an argument you might see from kind of your progressive, far lefty woke-toid types. And when you understand it and understand the philosophy behind it, it reveals itself to be a really, really bad argument. Anyways, the basics of the argument is that because of European colonialism, which resulted in the displacement of many indigenous peoples of the United States, then the entirety of the United States of America is considered stolen land, and therefore anyone's private property claims to the land is therefore invalid, and thus everyone should be allowed onto this so-called unowned land or illegally owned land. They're basically saying that the idea of labeling immigrants as illegal is hypocritical because the land itself was allegedly obtained through, you know, morally questionable means. And as I said, there's a lot of problems with this argument. The first of these is that you can't really say that indigenous people own the entirety of the United States through some kind of ancestral claim in the past, because that doesn't actually make sense. It's not actually true when you understand homesteading. The indigenous people of the United States didn't homestead the entire land of the United States of America. The places where they actually built their huts only constitute a very, very, very small fraction of the United States land. So to claim that they somehow collectively own all of the United States is kind of an ironic argument, because it's basically an ethno-nationalist argument but for indigenous people only, implying that they just collectively own all of this land just because they do. Which is silly because, again, this argument usually is coming from the far left. However, you could easily spin the same reasoning to claim that white people collectively own all of Europe. But you know, that's probably not the argument that these woke scolds were intending to make, but technically it follows the same reasoning. So it's a very inconsistent argument as well. But the real problem is that the land in most cases isn't actually stolen. Again, the indigenous people in the United States history only actually homesteaded very small fractions of United States land. Most of the land was actually largely largely unused back then. But there's also just general historical inaccuracies. Like, for example, a recent one we saw is in the immigrant protest or the LA riots that recently happened, where they're claiming that California was stolen from Mexico, and therefore Mexicans have a right to be there because they're just reclaiming what was stolen from them. And the thing is, that's not actually true. What actually happened was that in order to end the conflict between the Mexican government and the United States back in the early 1800s of the time, they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which involved purchasing California for $15 million. And so saying that that counts as stolen land when it actually became part of the United States based on a treaty, it's not very accurate to say. And then of course there's just the general wound collecting problem of seeking out ancestral crimes. This idea of saying, oh, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was wronged, and because you share a skin color with the person who wronged him, you are therefore guilty and you owe me for this theft. And that doesn't really make any logical sense. In order for crimes to happen, they need to be specific. Who specifically did the crime, specifically to who? In order for the claim to make sense, you need actual evidence of that on an individual basis. And specifically when it comes to claims of land, you would need something in writing proving that that ancestor actually would leave that specific plot of land to this specific person. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever to say, oh, my ancestors just collectively owned all of this massive millions of square miles of land, and therefore I should own it. That doesn't actually work. That doesn't actually make sense. If we were to allow these kind of ancestral crimes with very flimsy, loose, non-specific evidence to go through, then anybody could subjectively claim without evidence that they just own a certain arbitrary plot of land, which would obviously just cause conflicts rather than resolve them. And so when we look behind the mask of the claim that no one is illegal on stolen land, what we really see is just collective guilt and collective victimhood, tied to vague statements of land ownership that don't actually have any evidence behind them, which just in general, most of the time doesn't really make sense in terms of morality. Whenever anybody's seeking recompense for a crime that happened, let's say just 600 years ago or whatever, you're looking at crimes committed by people to people who are dead. They don't exist anymore. And so arguments like this usually just come from somebody who doesn't really care. They weren't actually alive during the time. They're just pretending to care so that way they can gain victim points, which they can use to justify stealing. So it's just another example among the many examples out there of how victimhood is often the face of many false moral claims. And plus, another funny thing about this argument is just how a lot of times you might see woke white liberals making this argument. And the thing is, a lot of them don't realize that if you make this argument, you must concede that the morally correct thing for you to do is to give your property up to a random indigenous person for free and try to move back to Europe. And I have a very sneaky suspicion that very few of them would actually be willing to put their money where their mouth is on this one. So yeah, I'll just move on to the next argument. And to be fair, I'm going to go over next the ethno-nationalist argument against open borders, which is the argument that white people collectively own all of the United States, and thus all the browns should be kept out, and taken to its extreme version, kicked out. And the problem, of course, is it kind of falls victim to a similar idea with the stolen land argument in the previous thing I just went over. It kind of makes these sweeping claims to vague and non-specific massive plots of land without evidence of either homesteading nor inheritance. In order for private property claims to be valid, you have to actually use the land. You have to transform the land into, say, a house or a farm or something. You can't just point to random areas like an entire mountain and claim, oh, I saw this mountain first, therefore I own the mountain. That's not how it works. The point of private property ownership, at least from the standpoint of libertarian philosophy, is that it's designed to avoid conflict. So for example, if person A builds a house on an acre of land or whatever, and person B comes along and claims that they own that house just because they do, well then person B is causing a conflict with person A when they don't need to, and thus they're considered to be in the wrong. And that conflict causing would be a very big problem in the ethno-nationalist argument, or at least in the extreme version. Kicking all the non-whites out would be an insanely expensive and bloody conflict. This is kind of why I often say that Wignots are usually just edgy teenagers. It's not really something anyone who's grown up and learned how the world works can actually unironically believe. To actually accomplish the ethno-nationalist logical conclusion would just be mass genocide, and that's obviously wrong. But perhaps the biggest problem of all is that it's the wrong solution to a real problem. Because I definitely understand, at least, why so many people on the right would rather live in a homogenous society. There is in fact very good evidence that diversity isn't actually always our strength, and that highly diverse societies can actually result in a low trust society. And the thing is, there's a much better solution to that problem that doesn't involve property rights violations of anybody. And that solution is mainly led by example of the Orania Project. The Orania Project is when a bunch of Afrikaneers went out and found a plot of land that wasn't homesteaded by anybody, and they transformed that land into a private city, and they then use freedom of association as a general rule for that private city in order to prevent non-Afrikaners from living there. It's basically a gated community on steroids. And in libertarian circles, this is often called the Hoppian solution. And so the real problem here is that in the United States, you don't have freedom of association and you're not able to make private cities that are free from interference by the state. United States citizens have not had freedom of association for over 50 years now, and so there's no real way to make true private communities that have actual exclusion rights. And there's also very good evidence showing that people generally prefer to live with those who are culturally similar to themselves. And so this would also allow other people from other cultures other than your own to also form their own private communities with similar rights of exclusion. And so thus the private city model gives you ability to create those homogenous societies in a way that is peaceful and voluntary, and it doesn't involve a bloody war involving millions of people being stripped of their property rights. And so that's the problem with the flip side of the whole stolen land argument. The ethno-nationalist argument falls under similar issues of where they try to make these sweeping general collective claims to massive plots of land that haven't been homesteaded at all, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't actually make any sense. And again, there's a much better, much more peaceful solution. So let's now move on to the liberal argument for open borders, or as I sometimes like to call it, the care-harm morality argument for open borders, which is that it's immoral to deny access to someone seeking a better life, which has some pedantic truth to it. Yes, a lot of times immigrants are obviously just seeking a better life, and in many cases telling someone that they're not allowed to do that can be kind of silly. But the problem with this argument is that the logic behind it can also be used to justify infinite gives-me-dats and infinite giving away private property, or basically just abolishing private property in general. Because if it's immoral to deny someone access just based on the claim, oh, they're just seeking a better life, then what right do you have to say that, oh, a random person from some random country or random wherever doesn't have the right to just move into your own home and take one of your rooms and live in it because, hey, they're just looking for a better life? And so indeed, this kind of justification can be used to justify the forceful giving of any kind of property to anybody else just based on that person not having it as good as the person that property comes from. And this is just kind of one of the basic philosophical problems of liberalism, is that when you push it to its logical conclusions, you eventually reach Marxism. You eventually reach this conclusion where it's totally okay and totally morally justified for one man who has less than another man to just steal from that man. And that doesn't actually make sense, because you need to give people private property rights. And the reason for why you need people to have private property rights is fairly simple, because it's really the only way to avoid these kind of conflicts. Just look at squatters, for example. Let's say you and your family go on vacation and you come back and now there's a squatter in your home and they refuse to leave. They're using your stuff, they're sleeping in your bed, etc., etc. And ultimately what the squatter has done is they have created a conflict, because your property is a scarce resource. Your belongings are scarce resources. And now somebody else has decided to use them even though you were the one that worked for them. You were the one that bought them. You were the one that put in the labor to create them or have them or trade for them. And so now that the squatter is there, you have a conflict and you need to have a way of saying who is responsible for the conflict. So that way some kind of justice can be done. In the midst of scarce resources, there has to be some kind of just owner. And that's where private property rights come in. It's just a way to figure out who is the just owner. So that way conflicts over scarce resources don't happen, or at the very least there's a way for the law to step in. And we see exactly what happens when you don't have those rights. There are a few areas in the United States that have these ridiculous squatters' rights, where if you come home and you see squatters in your house after you've been on vacation for a few weeks, you legally can't get rid of them. And yeah, it creates very serious problems. And it actually incentivizes squatters to create fake leases and whatnot, so that way they can delay the process of them being evicted from a place that they don't own. I won't go into too much detail, but if you Google nightmare squatter, you'll find some pretty ridiculous stories of what happens when property rights are not respected. And also, the liberal argument for open borders just kind of generally ignores freedom of association. When you have open borders and you don't have freedom of association, you're effectively forcing people to live in a community that they don't actually want to live in. Because without freedom of association, you don't have the right to say no. You don't have the right to exclude. And so a very easy counter to this is just simply asking, is Islam right about women? Just kind of calling to the obvious cultural incompatibility with Western feminism and Eastern Islam. You end up with neighbors with radically different moral systems that are in obvious contradiction to each other, and it just doesn't work. And so when you take away people's right to exclude, when you take away again the people's right to create a private community, people are left with no choice but to live in a community that they don't actually want. And so then the result is that these different moral systems in the community eventually lead to conflict as well. You end up with these low trust community hellholes that are not ideal for any of the residents. And that's why a lot of times trash libs don't really have a good answer to is Islam right about women? It actually just causes their minds to experience a stack overflow. It just kind of directly calls out the utopian thinking of assuming that everyone's equal, everyone believes the same thing, everyone can get along, blah, 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 which would be nice if that was true. The problem is it's very obviously not true. And so the liberal argument for open borders is really based on these kind of pie in the sky feelings over facts, wishing we lived in a different reality than we actually do argument, which just obviously doesn't make any sense. You obviously have to base your beliefs about reality on reality, how it actually is, not on how you wish it was. Or a simple answer is no, it's not immoral to deny access to someone seeking a better life if that seeking involves taking away somebody else's private property or violating somebody else's rights in some way. And in this case, they are ignoring both private property rights and ignoring freedom of association, which in my personal opinion is a very big liberal mistake of the modern world. I would not be surprised at all if historians in 100 years from now look back on this thinking and just ask themselves, what the heck were we doing? But yeah, anyway, next up, let's go over the socialist argument for open borders, which a lot of times socialist societies in the past, socialist countries, communist countries, they generally don't have open borders. So it's interesting to see this argument prop up from a lot of progressive socialists today living in the United States. And so you might question, why do they have this open borders belief? And the answer is it's entirely consequentialist within the realms of democracy. You see, socialists have figured out that if we have a more open borders policy, especially towards countries that are generally less educated, just kind of on average, then those people will come in and eventually vote for more socialist policies. Or in other words, people of low income and with little to no education in economic theory are significantly more likely to vote for Gibbs. And so thus a lot of socialists and neo-Marxists in the United States are starting to adopt a more open borders policy simply because they realize that importing these people is more likely to get socialism. Now, the problem with this argument, of course, just comes down to the fact that it obviously doesn't work. When we look at, for example, the Scandinavian model, we see very clear evidence that people from low-income countries who are brought in just as economic migrants do not pay into the system what they take out. And so if you're to take that to the extreme and adopt an open borders policy, making it even easier for people with low income to come in and thus take advantage of progressive welfare systems, well, you just kind of run into the obvious problem that open borders plus a welfare state just doesn't work at all. Because the thing is, the quality of life in the United States under the welfare system, so in other words, the life that is enjoyed by welfare queens, is honestly not a great life, but it is a better life than what many third world countries currently offer. And so when you have open borders plus welfare state in a first world country, what you're really doing is you're just incentivizing a bunch of non-net payers to come in and just completely drain the coffers. And that's why kind of believing in both welfare state plus open borders is an insane thing to believe. It just obviously would not work. It's political and economic suicide. The state would eventually not be able to pay out welfare to everybody eligible to it, leading to massive debt and inflation until total economic collapse. And the fact that many socialists don't understand this is kind of funny because it just further proves that socialists don't understand basic economics. They don't understand scarcity, and so naturally they don't see the obvious contradiction in open borders plus Gibbs, which is probably why not all socialists believe this. Let's move on to the socialist argument against open borders, which partially just comes from the fact that not all socialists are insane and economically illiterate enough to not understand why open borders plus welfare equals economic collapse, but there's also a few other reasons why some socialists don't like open borders. Namely, democratic socialists who still believe in a market system, but just with a larger progressive welfare system than we currently have. Like, for example, the argument that Bernie Sanders gave 10 years ago in a Vox interview, where he said that open borders was a Koch brothers proposal. And he claimed that a nation mainly has obligations to help the poor people within that nation, because when you have open borders, what that really does is that it just gives an incentive for companies to bring in people to work for $2, $3 an hour or whatever. Whereas on the flip side, Bernie Sanders puts it, it's much easier to control wages and increase wages when you have reduced competition. And so thus, by excluding people, it makes it easier for certain socialist policies to kind of work. Which, on a simplified level, there's a basic idea of correctness in what Bernie is saying. It is true that a socialist country without open borders will last longer than a socialist country with open borders, for reasons I explained earlier. When you have open borders with welfare, it just incentivizes people who are poor and are thus eligible for that welfare to come in from the third world and just drain the coffers, just completely drain your economy away. But the problem is that it still kind of sucks. A socialist country that has closed borders still is a crappy place to live. I mean, you can just kind of look at North Korea, for example, as just a simple way of how this doesn't really work. I mean, it's better at least from a consequentialist perspective than the open border socialist policy, but it's still bad because there's pretty good evidence that you actually get better economic growth, which improves people's lives better than any kind of welfare system when you have an immigration system that at least allows for some skilled immigration to come in, and you don't have a progressive welfare system. Between the two, if you're again just going entirely by outcomes, the latter actually has better economic outcomes. And plus, very few socialists in the United States actually believe this anymore. But anyways, before we get into the libertarian arguments, let's just go over one last argument, but not the least argument. And that is the conservative argument for less immigration, which is basically the my country first argument. Or in this case, since we're going on focusing on the United States, the America first argument, which is arguing that the state should first focus on improving the lives and maintaining the rights of the people who live within that state. And it's primarily more of a consequentialist argument than the ethno-nationalist argument. The conservative argument is more or less that usually immigration from the third world comes with a lot of problems, and so we should just not allow that immigration to avoid those problems. Now, specifically what those problems are kind of differs from conservative to conservative, but generally those problems include national security issues. So for example, when you have open borders, it's harder to make sure that criminals and terrorists, etc., are not immigrating into the country. There's also similar concerns alongside the socialist argument against open borders. So for instance, a lot of conservatives believe in not necessarily getting rid of all of the welfare system either, and so they also worry about the economic impact of uncontrolled immigration plus welfare, which, to their credit, they're absolutely correct about that. You very obviously cannot have open borders plus welfare. Again, I just kind of like to stress how completely insane it is to believe that those two things together can work. But anyway, conservatives also care about things like the rule of law or sovereignty and cultural cohesion, so a lot of the things that we've kind of already talked about. And admittedly, a lot of these things are valid points. The only real weakness of them is that it just comes from a purely consequentialist perspective. And what exactly is wrong with that? Well, let's now finally move on to the libertarian argument for open borders. And this is where the rabbit hole really begins. And there's kind of two sides to the libertarian argument for open borders, because there's really two different main arguments. One is the tech bro argument, which is arguing for open borders from an economic perspective, and the other is arguing for open borders from a purely ethical perspective. This is the argument that tech companies need to be able to engage in talent acquisition, so open borders will allow those companies to get the top global talent. Thus, you'll have the best talent working for those tech companies at the highest skilled jobs, thus leading to economic growth, or just general more market efficiency, because by matching labor to the skills with the demand, that reduces any kind of inefficiency within those tech industries. And they'll also sometimes argue that this allows for greater global collaboration within the top minds, and so thus you have a free exchange of ideas, thus leading to a greater productivity of those ideas. And so really the whole thing is just a consequentialist argument for greater economic growth and technological advancement. Their argument is that a more open immigration system for at least tech companies in the tech industry leads to better tech, which leads to a better quality of life for most people. And the interesting thing about the tech bro argument is that on a lot of levels they are technically correct. And a lot of what they have to say in this actually is pretty good reasoning for at least why you can't have a closed borders policy. Again, at least from a consequentialist perspective. Totally closed borders ironically has very similar problems to totally open borders. For example, you could say that a consequence of open borders is that you have too many low IQ, low skill immigrants, and thus your society has an average lower IQ. And the thing is, shutting out higher IQ, higher skilled immigrants has the same problem and effect. But anyways, now for the moral and philosophical argument for open borders from a libertarian's perspective, which is quite possibly one of the most heavily misunderstood arguments from everywhere else in the political spectrum. Mainly because when you understand it, you realize they aren't really arguing for open borders, but rather just claiming that statist borders are illegitimate because they come from the state. But every single open borders libertarian that uses the moral argument would technically be perfectly fine with a private city with private borders that excludes people. And it should be stressed that if you ever come across a person claiming to be a libertarian that doesn't believe that, then they're not really a libertarian, because anyone who denies private property rights exist is probably just an anarcho-communist who is claiming the label of libertarian for themselves because they think that's good optics. So that's the first important point. But rather, what the open borders libertarians, the actual libertarians who have this position, what they're really saying is that because the land of the borders of the state should be considered illegitimate, that land is therefore unowned. And so then they pose the question, okay, who is aggressing on who when someone passes through unowned land? And the thing is, on a very simple level, they're actually correct in this question. Technically, no one is aggressing on anybody when they pass through unowned land. And so that doesn't really violate the NAP, and therefore open borders, at least on a logical libertarian philosophical level, does make sense. Because the issue that they have with statist land is that the way the state gains land doesn't really follow the libertarian ethics or rules of homesteading. Homesteading, or the idea why land actually becomes owned under libertarian philosophy, requires you to actually be utilizing the land in a way that you need it. Like for someone to own a 4-acre self-sustaining farm, they have to actually toil the land, build their house on it, plant those crops, build a fence around it, or basically transform the land with your labor, with your work, with your resources, in a way that shows that you're using this land, etc., etc. The main point here, though, is just that you can't just point to massive amounts of land and say that you own it. You can't point to all the mountains around you and say, I'm pointing to these mountains first, therefore I own these mountains. It doesn't really work that way. And the problem is that's exactly what the state does. The state just kind of points to all of this land everywhere around them and claims that they own it because they just say so. Or in other words, they just claim a territorial monopoly and then they threaten force upon anybody who disagrees with that. And so the Open Borders Libertarian is just looking at that from the philosophical perspective that those state borders should be considered illegitimate because states acquired them through illegitimate means. And so all this might then bring into question, well, what exactly could the closed borders libertarian stance possibly be? And the answer is that the closed borders libertarian stance comes from recognizing the flaws in the open borders libertarian stance and how it just kind of ignores a lot of context. Because when you translate philosophy to policy, you have to recognize that in the real world, policies cannot really be just islands to themselves, but rather policies have second order and third order and fourth order effects on other policies. Or TLDR, things be complex. And so a lot of it kind of just starts from this one simple question. And a lot of it also kind of comes down to a simple question, which is, as long as there is a state, should the state act more in line with the goal of defending people's property rights rather than the opposite? And while some libertarians push to the extreme conclusions may be tempted to say no to this question, there's some really big problems and big implications that come from answering no to this. For example, you would be forced to say that in a communist dictatorship, if that communist dictatorship decided to outlaw all libertarians, in other words, declare that all libertarians within the communist dictatorship are now outside of the law, and it is thus legal to do anything to them, if you answer no to that question of the state defending people's property rights rather than the opposite, well then, logically, you're forced to believe that the communist dictatorship outlawing all libertarians is a good thing. And that creates an issue because that is, of course, completely batshit insane. This is just a simple example of why you can't necessarily disconnect philosophy from the reality it is forced to exist in. You will never achieve liberty if you're okay with the communists declaring open season on everybody who is pro-liberty. That kind of black and white thinking would effectively make libertarianism a failed philosophy, because then it can no longer be applied to how human beings actually are. Therefore, libertarians have to go for the solution that results in the least amount of property rights violations when faced with situations where there is no perfect solution. Which brings us back to the border. If we really take a look at how the border works and think of how a libertarian society would work, we realize that borders aren't necessarily unowned land, but rather they're actually just contested land. A world run by the philosophy of Mises Caucus libertarians would look very, very different than the way the world currently operates. For those of you who aren't significantly keyed into how libertarian philosophy actually works when pushed to its logical conclusion, the world would kind of look sort of like a bunch of very, very tiny monarchies, but they would be run under natural law theory, and thus it would be more like a CEO rather than a king. And the reason these would form is because people would voluntarily want to be a part of these kind of societies, because when they're run by natural law, there's a very big difference in incentive of the owner, which is that they have to create a safe society that people actually want to be a part of. And so naturally these societies would have private borders and would have exclusionary rules. A simple understanding of why this would happen is just to kind of look at this image right here. And this, I think, kind of is the reason why a lot of general conservatives and Republicans are more okay and more favorable to Hoppians like myself than other libertarians. Because those of us of the Hoppian position immediately understand the problem with this image, which is that, as it turns out, we live in a society. Sure, technically this house is yours and the other houses are not yours, but would you be okay in living in this neighborhood if these were your neighbors? No, of course not. You would almost certainly want to sell that house and move. And thus, in this regard, nobody actually really believes this. To think that society can't possibly have any kind of effect on your quality of life whatsoever is, to be frank, and this is honestly the nicest way I can possibly put it, extremely childish and naive. The reality is, when given a choice, most people will peacefully and voluntarily choose to live with people who are similar to themselves. Which is how Hoppianism kind of achieves homogeneous societies through peace rather than coercion. The Muslims get their Liechtenstein, the Christians get their Liechtenstein, you get a Liechtenstein, and you get a Liechtenstein, everybody gets their Liechtenstein. And thus, a decentralized world run by natural law theory, made up of tens of thousands of Liechtensteins, is how the world would actually operate under this kind of libertarian philosophy. As I've kind of said before in other videos, the best way to understand this is to think of the world the way it currently operates as Kazaa, and to think of the Hoppian libertarian world as more like BitTorrent. It would be decentralized, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wouldn't be any kind of rules, and it certainly doesn't mean that there'd be no borders. And of course, in this world, the philosophy of libertarian open borders then makes perfect sense, because of course any land that has not been homesteaded by one of these Liechtensteins, of course, should be open to all. So in this kind of global Liechtenstein version of ANCAP theory, yeah, open borders make sense. But that is, of course, because of the context. Moving back to the unfortunate reality that we currently live in, we have to consider the policies that currently actually exist, that we unfortunately currently live under, and consider what those policies actually do. And I think the biggest flaw of the libertarian open borders position in the reality we currently exist is that they're just kind of failing to recognize the logical reality of parentheses. Parentheses x plus y end parentheses is not the same thing as x. For example, we recognize this in basic theory of right and wrong in self-defense as recognizing that shooting someone plus they are actually putting your life in danger and thus giving you no choice is not the same thing as simply shooting someone. That's basically the line between murder and self-defense. Pretty basic, I'm pretty sure everybody can understand that. But what about open borders? Is the libertarian stance on open borders combined with how the world currently operates and what the state currently does the same thing as the libertarian stance on open borders and how it would actually work under libertarian theory and practice? No, obviously, of course not. And so we need to look at things a little bit more under the microscope here. The borders that the state has illegitimately drawn, what those borders really are is their contested land. Because without the state inflicting ridiculous zoning laws, people would surely homestead a lot of this land, and Liechtensteins would naturally form. And of course, there's other problems with laws in the state that combine with open borders to create other problems that violate people's property rights in ways that are more unique and more direct. And there's two of these that most Hoppians will point out as kind of the two biggest problems, which is the welfare state and lack of freedom of association. In the United States, people have not had freedom of association for over 50 years. People do not have the right to exclude, and thus no kind of effective private society can actually be formed. And then of course you have the welfare state. Any immigrant that comes in immediately gains the benefit of a lot of things that they aren't actually paying for. And it's more than just simply being eligible for certain welfare programs like SNAP or TANF, or housing assistance for the poor, etc., etc. There's also other just basic infrastructure things like the public school system and public roads that have been paid for by, unfortunately, extracting wealth from taxpayers, aka theft. But when immigrants come in, they're really just getting to take advantage of that despite the fact that they didn't actually pay into it. And yes, those two problems are pretty big. Honestly, it's not really the biggest problem. The real issue with open borders, the real problem where the x plus y does not equal x, is actually just the very state of democracy. The combination of open borders with democracy creates massive property rights violations. Because under this combination, anybody who comes into the state immediately gains the right to basically take away your property if they can get enough other people on their side. And I think a lot of people don't really think about that when they think about democracy. They don't really think about the reality that voting is inherently an act of aggression. Specifically, when you are voting to take away another person's property, you are effectively asking a large violent gang to forcibly extract wealth from someone else and give it to you. This is in terms of philosophy and ethics no different than hiring someone to rob your neighbor, an act that is very obviously wrong. And a lot of times I'll see open borders libertarians say, this is a consequentialist argument, and I think that's very disingenuous. Because one, it's not really consequentialist, I'll go more into that later, but really, you can't really call something consequentialism if it's literally happening. Again, going back to why socialists in the United States have suddenly cried out for open borders, it's because they've realized that importing a lot of people who are uneducated on economics from the third world, well, those people are more likely to vote for more authoritarian policies. They're more likely to inch things towards socialism. And specifically, the Democratic Party in the United States has figured this out. And that's specifically why they don't really enforce the borders at all anymore whenever they're in power. Because they realize that it's beneficial to them in the voting booth. This is not a consequentialist argument. If you just look at voting trends and Democratic strategy, it has been the current Democrat strategy for the past 20 years or so. And so we are already the frog that is in the boiling pot. We already need to do something about it. This isn't consequentialism, it's your current reality, whether you like it or not. But even if it wasn't, it wouldn't really be consequentialism if we look back at that old question that is originally asked. Who is being aggressed upon when an immigrant crosses into the border under the way the United States currently operates? And this is where things get a little bit interesting because I have a take on this that is a little bit different than other libertarians have, which is that I personally actually do believe open borders can work in the way the United States currently operates, and that it would be ethical. But there's a really big catch to this. See, I believe that we should adopt an open borders policy, but for libertarians only. No, seriously, think about it. When an immigrant crosses into the border of the United States, it's generally not an act of aggression, depending on their intent. If they are a communist crossing into the United States with the intent to vote for more Gibbs and take advantage of the welfare system, then I would argue that that person crossing the border is in fact an act of aggression. Whereas when a libertarian crosses the border, they don't have an intent on those things. In fact, their intent is to use their voting rights to actually reduce the state. And yes, I'm aware this might sound like an insane take, but if you think about it logically, it makes sense. Just because the rights to democratically expropriate property that a person gains by passing these state borders within a democratic state in an open border system shouldn't exist, doesn't change the fact that they do. And so the open borders libertarian position has thus committed a classic nirvana fallacy, checking libertarian theory against Ancapistan inside their head instead of checking against, the reality that we actually live in. Yes, statist borders in an ideal libertarian world would not and should not exist, but we don't live in that world. The reality we do exist in is a reality where the state lines are not arbitrary and do not represent owned land. Rather, they represent a line of jurisdiction that a person becomes a part of by crossing that line. Whether that is ethical or not does not matter, because it is what currently happens. It is the reality we exist in. And so an open borders policy, as long as we have democracy and welfare and forced integration, etc., but mainly the problem is democracy, would not actually get rid of that line. People would still gain the things that come with said jurisdiction, unless you can get rid of those problems first. The truly open borders libertarian position can only exist by completely ignoring this reality and completely avoiding the context. And if you look at a lot of open borders libertarian arguments, they all commit this problem. They all ignore the issues of policy combinations and the reality we actually exist in, and how things would actually work. Therefore, when a commie crosses the line and gains the fraudulent rights of said state jurisdiction to vote away property rights, and essentially vote to steal your property, vote for theft, etc., that is an act of aggression. But when a libertarian crosses those lines, no such issue exists, no such aggression happens. That I agree with. And therefore, the correct and ethical border policy is unironically a keep the commies out immigration policy. And you can actually test the sensibility of this border policy by reading into a lot of open borders arguments from other libertarians. Like, for example, if we look at the book Open Borders by Brian Kaplan, The Science and Ethics of Immigration, which is basically just a large comic book that shows a lot of the arguments for open borders, from, of course, a libertarian perspective. And the thing is, his arguments all pretty much make sense and work, with one little caveat. They only make sense if you assume that the people immigrating are libertarian-minded. Like, for example, this one right here, talking about how America's golden goose survived the open borders era and actually thrived very well. Well, yeah, of course it did. Because back in the 1800s and early 1900s, immigration costed a lot more because the trip itself was a lot more arduous, but also the United States back then really lacked a welfare state, and there was a very severe limit on what you could vote for. The government was a lot more minarchist back then. And of course, there was freedom of association back then. And so an immigrant coming to the United States back then, well, the only reason you would actually come to the United States is a seeking of opportunity in a free society. Immigrants back then saw a barren world where the value they got out of it depended on the value they brought. In other words, it incentivized libertarian immigration only. That's why it worked. But of course, these days, the world is very different. The United States government and the way it works and the rules it currently has is very different. Immigrants coming in now can simply check into the nearest welfare office. No need to actually bring any value with them. They can just mooch. And of course, vote for more Gibbs because the government is nowhere near as minarchist as it was back then. But of course, even today, if those immigrants coming in were libertarian immigrants, then it would still work. So in other words, this argument makes perfect sense so long as the immigrants are libertarian-minded, and the argument completely fails if the immigrants are communist-minded. They would just kill the golden goose, spread the stolen wealth, and then when their ridiculous system collapses, they would claim that it wasn't true communism. And really, you can repeat this analysis for every single argument in this book. Like, for instance, when he mentions that open borders is Niagara Falls economics, because immigrants coming in to work and add to the economy makes everybody richer. Yeah, that's true. If they're coming in and they're not leeching off the welfare system, and they're not voting for more socialism, then yeah, this argument works. But as soon as you replace the libertarian immigrants with communists, the argument immediately fails. And that's kind of the flaw of the libertarian open borders position, is that they're forgetting that people are not all the same. People aren't equal in how they act and how they believe, and what their incentives are and what their plans are. The cultural aspect of the whole ordeal and the whole lack of freedom of association that's a problem too. But the real problem, from just a libertarian ethics philosophical position, is that all of the logic that open borders libertarians use just immediately fails when you try to apply that logic to a communist immigrant, due to, again, the reality that we live in. And so, in an interesting twist of irony, this book of Open Borders is actually defeated by the book The Myth of the Rational Voter, also coincidentally by Brian Kaplan. Funny how that works, isn't it? And also, one final issue to point out before really concluding all of this is that a lot of the open borders libertarian arguments are actually better served as just arguments for free trade, which Hoppe himself mentions in his case for free trade and restricted immigration. Like, for example, the Starvin' Marvin scenario, where a man in one country is starving and has money to spend that at a supermarket that is in another country, and he is then stopped by Border Patrol and is then forced to go home and starve because he can't spend his money at the grocery store. This is definitely wrong, but it's not really an argument necessarily for open borders. In fact, you could use this same argument against private borders if it was a private city. The real issue here is that there's no free trade. And the real solution would be, well, why can't this Starvin' Marvin guy, just pay to have the food shipped to him? And so that way he doesn't even need to go into another country in order to get his food. And that's just another issue I have with a lot of common arguments for open borders. A lot of the problems they point out are actually just solved by having free trade. And so it's kind of an ignoratio elenchi fallacy. Fantastic argument against protectionism, but not so great an argument against borders. But anyways, to wrap this up, we have to ask the question, what would be a good, effective immigration policy for the United States in this situation? Because of course, one little problem with my idea of open borders for libertarians only is that while on a philosophical level it makes perfect sense, the problem of course is we can't read people's minds who are applying to immigrate into the United States and know for sure if they're a libertarian or not. So yeah, there is that kind of difficulty. And the answer to that is I think we should allow immigrants in so long as they, on a personal level, don't have an incentive to vote for communist policies. So we kind of have to look at things back in the way the United States used to operate, back when open borders actually did kind of work in the 1800s and early 1900s. So perhaps policies such as restricting immigration to people who don't have a bachelor's degree so they're not educated on economics, and restricting immigration to people who don't have enough money so that way they wouldn't be eligible for any kind of welfare applications anyways. And I think there should just be an additional screening process to ensure that they are somewhat libertarian minded. And to some degree, I guess the Republicans are kind of correct in that, yeah, you do want to verify who's coming into the country in order to figure all of these things out. So in that sense, you could also throw in the national security checkup there, because terrorists coming into the country with intent to do people harm while taking advantage of the open borders and taking advantage of United States infrastructure to do that, you could easily argue that that's a violation of people's property rights as well. I know that none of that is perfect within libertarian philosophy, but what the open borders libertarians need to understand is that there currently is no viable perfect solution that can actually be implemented right now. Because of the way the world currently operates, every solution you can possibly come up with has some issues and results in some kind of property rights reduction. And so we should therefore instead go for the policy that is the least insane. But again, we need to, if we want to be libertarians with actual sense of strategy in our heads, we need to stop letting perfect be the enemy of better. Because that is what letting communists into your country for the sake of principles over open borders effectively is. Which is especially silly because again, when you consider the parentheses issue, it really isn't a principled position. I mean, just think about it for 2 seconds and you'll realize that communists getting to vote to take your property rights away obviously is a violation of property rights. And therefore that is the best possible immigration policy in the way that the world currently operates, if we want to have a future that is based in liberty rather than madness. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the matter. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or again by checking out this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.